Well, an estimated 225,000 women are victims of violence from their partners each year in France, and a woman dies there from it every 3 days. Well, President Emmanuel Macron addressed these startling statistics today, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women.
Our situation up to now shows that something is not working in our country. The shame that women experience, a shame without reason, since they are already victims. That shame should be experienced by the perpetrators of violence. It is a civic and political shame. It is a national disgrace.
Well, another major issue is triggering outrage in France. CNN's exclusive report, which uncovered a horrific modern-day slave market. As you may recall, our reporting revealed migrants being sold as slaves in Libya.
A man addressing an unseen crowd. Big, strong boys for farm work, he says. 400. 700. 700. 800. The numbers roll in. These men are sold for 1,200 Libyan pounds, $400 apiece.
Well, the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights says people of African descent are frequently denied their rights. His words come as demonstrators in Paris are demanding action against what the French president calls a crime against humanity. Melissa Bell joins us now live from Paris, where new demonstrations are taking place. And of course, Melissa, these protests sparked by the CNN investigation that I was just mentioning. Just explain for us what's expected today.
This is the third time that demonstrators have come out, Linda, to protest against these images. I mean, I think what's interesting is that here in France, the sense of revulsion has spilled out into protests, as it has in other countries, particularly in a number of African countries, ever since those images were shown by CNN. But here in France, there is also the political will to do something about it. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has really taken the lead on this, calling for an urgent reunion of the United Nations. He wants this discussed at United Nations level in order that something can be done. Of course, we await the results of the Libyan inquiry itself. But once again, here in Paris, people have come out now in fewer numbers than they had yesterday or last week when they held a sort of wildcat demonstration on the Champs-Élysées. But still, those who are here are extremely angry, extremely outraged, Linda, by what they've seen in those pictures, and determined that something should now be done by the European Union in particular. They believe, those here, that the EU really bears its share of responsibility for what's gone on in Libya, what's been found to go on, since it was a deal between the EU and Tripoli that has allowed over the course of the last few months the numbers of migrants arriving on European shores to fall, but the numbers of migrants caught in Mediterranean seas to be sent back to Libya. Of course, CNN's footage really casts a new light on that particular deal, and there are many calls here in Europe for that to be looked at again.
And Melissa, just talk to us about the French connection with Libya. As you mentioned, this is the third protest there. Why are people protesting in France?
Well, I think that there is a sense that perhaps the French president, who has a greater degree of strength perhaps than either London, given Brexit, or Berlin these days, given Angela Merkel's political difficulties of the moment, to see this thing through. And he has really grasped the nettle on this, calling these possible crimes against humanity and urging that the UN look in. So he is absolutely driving that. But there is the political will, but of course also this real anger on the streets. And I think we've seen it perhaps more in Paris than in other European cities, because France has such large communities of Malians, Nigerians, Chadians, people who come from the very countries that many of the migrants now caught in Libya come from. And we're talking, Linda, according to UN figures, about 700,000 to 1 million migrants currently in Libya. And it is extremely urgent, says the French president, that something is done to help them.
And Melissa, you mentioned that the French president is calling for an emergency United Nations meeting. How soon could that happen? What sort of action could be taken?
Well, we've heard also, Linda, interestingly, of the determination of the United Nations General Secretary, who's also very quickly come out to say that these could constitute crimes against humanity and therefore should be looked at. So there is also that will on the other side of the Atlantic at the UN headquarters themselves. Another thing to note is the interest in this that the African Union is taking. Its head has said over the course of the last 24 hours that African countries have to bear their share of responsibility for the fact that all of these young Africans are so desperate to leave their own countries that they should find themselves in the slave markets that we've seen in Libya and attempting the dangerous crossing that we've been talking about over the course of the last few years. So I think there is this huge will to act. And what's interesting also is that we've known about this since the International Office of Migration had been warning about this for many months. We've had an idea that this was going on in Libya. It really took CNN's image, I think, to shock those in power and those on the street here in Paris into action. In a sense, these are pictures that once you've seen them, you really can't forget them. And I think that is really what's behind these sorts of demonstrations that we've seen. And there is a real determination amongst those here today that they will carry on trying to make their voices heard, that this is no longer allowed to go on in the 21st century.
Yeah, certainly some great reporting from Nema El Bagher and her team, and good to have you there for Perspective from Paris. Thank you very much, Melissa Bell.